Pittsburgh is home to Eternal Magic the Gathering. Champs this year was bigger than ever, and I will give you a first look at the data coming out of Vintage Eternal Weekend in North America, as well as a recap of my experience playing both the events. Hello and welcome back, Vintage Gamers. I have returned from Eternal Weekend, this time in Pittsburgh, in the United States. It was an amazing event, honestly. 385 players for Vintage, 995 players for Legacy. Just an astounding Eternal Weekend. When you give people, the advance notice they need, they're going to come out and play these Eternal formats. And I was really happy because a trend we were seeing pre-COVID was that every year Eternal Weekend would get a little bit smaller, unless people were able to make it out or this and that. But this year, plenty of events notice. It wasn't on a holiday weekend, and players really turned up to play Eternal formats. And so I was lucky enough to be in Pittsburgh and played in both the Vintage and Legacy events. And I'm going to take, this video to just go over my tournament. It'll be a lot less about the tourism stuff because I've been to Pittsburgh many times, and it's not like I'm traveling to Munich and Prague for the first time. This weekend was mostly about Magic and the Gathering for me. So mostly it's going to be about just the tournament itself, rounds I played, and actually people's first look at the metagame sheets. I have transferred over all of Melee's data and cleaned it up. I'm still missing a couple deck lists that I think Nick Koss will be able to get to me so I can finish the entire sheet. Some people handed it in via paper. But I have a pretty complete look at the data from Eternal Weekend in North America. And it's very interesting because the data is pretty different from Eternal Weekends, especially Eternal Weekend Europe. So let's start with the deck list. What did I choose to play in this event? You can see it here, and I'm going to bring it up here. This is my Oath deck. I played 74 of the 75 cards that I used to top 8 Eternal Weekend in Europe. Part of this is I thought the deck list was pretty good, and part of it is, in fact, just running out of time / laziness. So I was a little worried, and the reason I was a little worried is because in the time between Eternal Weekend in Europe and the Eternal Weekend in NA, a new version of Lurrus Control popped up that was blue-white instead of blue-black. And if you follow my channel, I've been hinting at this for months almost. Since the blue-black deck has been popularized, I said the blue-black deck is probably not the best way to build it for the field. It was a great choice for the weekend it came out, and maybe even a couple weekends after that. But once people realized that the blue-black deck was like very weak to very certain things, like an Oath of Druids, there had to be changes made and adjustments made, and eventually there were. Mogged and Discoveran had some top finishes with a blue-white version of the deck that is much more well-rounded against different permanents. When you have access to blue and when you have access to white, I should say, you have access to enchantment removal at a much higher level. You have access to Containment Priest, which is probably the single best card against this Oath of Druids deck. And so coming up on this weekend, I was very worried that a lot of the blue-black players would switch to blue-white. And that worry did actually come true. However, I was very busy between the Eternal Weekends. I was playing in that TFT tournament for basically a week and a half. So I didn't really have a lot of time, and I still hadn't really found another Tinker deck that I thought was better. And of course, I've had a lot of reps with Oath this year and a very good record with Oath this year. So I decided I will run back the Oath deck with almost no changes. The one change I made is this Oko in the sideboard. And the Oko in the sideboard was a bit of a late last-minute change. And it's replacing the Caracas, and it's meant to be another Oath Mirror Breaker. I still thought ahead of this tournament that Oath would be the most played deck. I was thinking Oath would be up around 15-20% of the metagame for this tournament. I thought Oath will be the deck to beat, and people should be gearing to beat it. And for me, I don't know if this is 100% fact check true, but as far as I can remember, since I started playing this version of Oath, I have an 100% win rate in the mirror. And I didn't break that win rate at all during this tournament. And so I felt that if 20% of the field is going to be Oath, and I'm going to have a highest chance of playing Oath mirrors, that would be very good for my chances of winning the tournament. So I elected to play the Oath deck. And for those players who don't know, like the Oath mirror is something that some players like, some players don't like. But what it comes down to is a mind game of how many oaths and show and tells is your opponent going to keep in. An experienced player might realize that Oath of Druids, being symmetrical and your opponent having Forbidden Orchard is not the most easy piece to game plan to execute. And so you might take out some, a lot, all of your oaths. And the number actually really changes from match to match, depending on who you're playing against and what you think their board plan is going to be. And so in general, what I did in sideboarding was I would take out 3 Oath of Druids and 3 Show and Tells and try to play Oko control. And the reason I take out 3 of each is that you are playing a Vampiric and Demonic tutor deck. Sometimes you do have Forbidden Orchard Supremacy, and you can tutor for Oath of Druids. Sometimes you do know that your opponent's hand has no Atraxas, and you can tutor for Show and Tell. So you gain a lot of value by having at least 1 copy in your deck. Now, this isn't always the case because some of these lists are playing 3 Thoughtseize in the main. That was a thing that Samuel Estrade and some of the Italians did over in Europe. And in that case, they can leave in more Show and Tells because they can Thoughtseize away your Atraxa and then play a Show and Tell. But in general, the most important card in the mirror is Oko. Oko is incredibly hard to interact with from this deck. It is a supreme answer to Atraxa. And it's also an answer to an Oath of Druids if your opponent's leaving in a bunch of Oath of Druids. By turning their Moxen into Elks, it's hard for them to trigger Oath of Druids. And so by having access to 4 Okos, you're giving yourself the best position to win the green-blue control mirror that is the Oath mirror. There are even more things you can do to win the Oath mirror. Something that Juju Bean and Nathan Sawyer did was they swapped a Dismember for an Eliminate. An Eliminate is a worse card against the field than Dismember, especially against mono white. But Eliminate is a way that you can actually kill an opposing Oko in this deck. There are a couple other cards you can choose in this slot. But by giving themselves an ability to kill an opposing Oko, they're setting themselves up to win the mirror. So that's basically it. That was the game plan. I'm going to do the same things I was doing in all my other Oath videos and all my Oath streams. Really beating up on blue-black, beating up on creature strategies, beating up on shops, non-combo shops, sphere-based shops, beating up on Bazaar, and that was the plan. These Serra Emissaries are very important in that regard. I don't think you're allowed to play this, or you are allowed to, but I don't think you should play this Show and Tell version of Oath without Serra's Emissary. I think this is an absolutely key card in making the deck a strong choice. Something worth talking about is the 1 Null Rod. You'll see when we start doing the data that Coveted Jewel had a very good tournament. Coveted Jewel was an excellent choice for this tournament, and the big reason it was is because Oath was going to be the major deck to beat. The Coveted Jewel deck has a good matchup against Oath, especially an Oath player who doesn't understand the intricacies of the matchup. Show and Tell is a huge liability in the matchup. However, when I went to Europe with Dan actually played Coveted Jewel in that tournament. Coveted Jewel did horrendously in Europe. And we play tested that matchup a lot. And it's really not that bad of a matchup for Oath. It's close. I wouldn't even say it's Oath favored. But the more you push towards the matchup and the more you understand how to mulligan your opening hands, it's pretty close to a 50-50 matchup. So when you add things like Thoughtseize in your board, and especially things like Null Rod, the matchup swings pretty reasonably into your favor. The first Null Rod was getting memed a little bit by casters, or even in the Discord, because you want to beat Jewel, but you're only playing 1 Null Rod. But the reality of the situation is the first Null Rod is not 1 Null Rod, it's more than 1 Null Rod because you're playing a Vampiric Demonic Tinker deck. It is not uncommon and happened a lot in testing where you want to tinker for a Null Rod in the matchup. It's not a real normal play, and you want to be tinkering for something powerful, but in the matchup, the Jewel deck is just not very good at playing the game if a Null Rod resolves. It's actually extremely hard for the Jewel deck to combat a Null Rod at all. So when you're playing these tutors, the first Null Rod is infinitely more powerful than the second Null Rod. And if you want to beat Jewel, there's nothing wrong with playing a second, a third, a fourth Null Rod. You can play these cards and win your Jewel matchup. Jewel is a deck that is power level is going to be based on how much people are sideboarding for it. Think of it like Dredge. If people are all cutting their Leyline of the Voids, Dredge gets better. If people are cutting their Null Rods and their combo oriented hate, Jewel gets better. And that's what you'll find actually for every vintage deck in the current metagame. The metagame cycle is typically metagame is a cycle, so it's secular. Cyclical. That's the word I was looking for. It's a cyclical metagame. So, the best deck is going to rotate as people change their sideboard. You have all the cards in Magic when you play Vintage, so you have access to all the tools to beat these decks. This was like very apparent when something like Initiative was entered to the format. It was hard for people initially to beat Initiative. But as people understood the play patterns of the deck better, started countering mana rocks, started to play more removal in their decks, Initiative has just become a normal piece of the metagame, which I think is really, really awesome. So that's why I decided to play this deck, mostly based on, I thought, the power level of the deck and the reps I had with the deck, and I thought the ability to win the mirror. So I said in the middle of this rant that I predicted that Oath would be 15 to 20% of the metagame. And let's see if that was the case. This is probably people's first look at the data for Eternal Weekend. Here you have the data sheet moved into the normal formatting. I guess we can go to graphs is probably the best way to do this. Can I zoom in? Of course not. Why would I be able to zoom in? This is your metagame for Eternal Weekend in North America. 68 out of 385 players playing Oath, the highest deck by a very large margin. Countervine, Luris, Saga, and Initiative as your next most played decks. And then a huge drop-off before Jewel, Beseech, Esper Saga, Doomsday, and Dredge. If you look at the numbers here, you do end up with Oath of Druids being 17.7% of the metagame. Oh, I could do browser zoom. Here we go. My bad. That might be a little bit more helpful. So here you go. Oath, 68. 44. So you have Oath, 3 times as much as Jewel, almost. And you have Oath being 17.7% of the metagame. Your other major players down at like the second tier, 11, around 10% of the metagame was Initiative, Luris, Saga, and Countervine. Countervine had a significantly high number of players. Then when you take that step down, and you start looking at some of the other decks that were, commonly played, I think you could pretty much combine Prison and Aggro Shops at this point. They kind of are very similar decks now. People are kind of hybridizing the list and playing the good cards, as it were. So you can say Sphere Shops, Dredge, Doomsday, Esper Saga, and Beseech were some of the other choices too. When you look at these decks and you look at this metagame where you see most popular deck Oath, Initiative is a very popular deck. It's very clear to me that Jewel ends up being a great choice for this deck, or this tournament, and the data really shows it. This is an extremely good showing from Jewel. This is a 62.6% win rate. That's very high. It is by far the best showing for Jewel among the 3 Eternal Weekends. I do have a combined data sheet we can go through too right after this. But you'll actually see that Oath ends up doing above average. So even though there was this many Oath decks, you have a lot of Oath mirrors, you still end up with a positive win rate on Oath. Luris Saga did pretty well into this field. Initiative and Countervine, on the other hand, did not. Beseech is another deck like Jewel that I think would do well into a field that was heavily these decks, Countervine, Luris Saga, Initiative, and Oath. So basically, if you played these combo-oriented decks into a field with so it's weird because Oath is a combo deck, right? But it's a very different kind of combo deck than Beseech and Jewel. It's a much better deck at beating creature-based decks, and sometimes even these controlling decks. But it really does fall prey in the combo mirror to these faster decks. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to me that if you have this field, you end up with these hyper aggressive combo decks coming out on top. It's worth noting that the best choice
for Bazaar in this field was actually Dredge, which is what I did tell my patrons before the event. The number of Luris Saga who don't have access to Leyline is very high, and decks that don't have access to Leyline have a hard time beating Dredge. Now, they're not like saying they're unfavored, but like when you play Leyline, it helps your Dredge matchup, right? so yeah. Someone asked, do we have a way to see Oath's win rate if we ignored the mirror matches? There's a way to do that statistically. It doesn't come up on this sheet. It's on my other sheet. So it's like a little hard, but we could probably get that if you really, really wanted to. An approximate number, that is. We could totally go in and do round by round pairings as well, but I don't find that to be super useful in these small field tournaments. And obviously 385 is not a small field tournament for Vintage, but it's just small in terms of data. Anyways, so what else was there in here? So good showing for these combo decks. Even playing Luris Saga was still a fine choice. Oath a fine choice. Doomsday, just a 50% win rate. Esper Saga, which won Europe, did not have a good tournament. A very, very poor showing, which is kind of how I felt when I tried the Esper Saga deck that won Europe. I did not think that deck was very good. It obviously has the tools to run hot and had a very competent pilot for the weekend, but that Esper Saga deck, I mean, I think I streamed it, right? I streamed it to a top 8, and I thought the deck was so bad the whole time as I top 8'd, right? So Esper Saga had a rough showing. Dredge, like I said, good. Actually pretty reasonable showing for prison shops and not for aggro shops. I don't know if these numbers are like a little fake because the decks kind of blend together a little bit. Maybe like if you combine these numbers, right, you end up somewhere around 50%, which is probably what I would say for a shops deck. I do think that the key to a shops deck performing well in this metagame is Null Rod. If your shops deck had Null Rod, I think you were in a much better place than if it didn't. I kind of saw that a little bit when I was doing the data. Some of the lists at the very bottom of the tournament were shops decks without Null Rod. Sphere shops decks without Null Rod. Like I saw some Ravagers and some things like that. So I actually do think that it's a little misleading here. And it's more based on if you chose to play your Null Rods in the main or not. There was a variety of different initiative tinkers down here at a very low number. Some of them did pretty well. But they actually like were extremely differently built. Some had rings, some didn't have rings, some had 4 initiative creatures, some had 8 initiative creatures. It was very hard to get a read on those. And actually one thing that won't show up on this list is there were actually a lot of unpowered decks. Not a huge number, actually less than I thought. But the number 1 unpowered deck for the tournament is actually Red Prison, Mono Red Stompy without power. You can see that one Mono Red Prison player, Toast here, actually lost their winning in for top 8 with powerless Red Prison. There were at least a couple Red Prison decks in this field. That shows up Dredge. So that's not going to be helpful. And I only typed 1 as Mono Red. Justin, how am I going to find it? 1 Mono Red Prison, 2, I called it Red Prison. All right, so if I search Red Prison, that'll help. 7 instances of Red Prison in this tournament. Not all of them did very well, obviously. 3-6, 3-6, 4-5, 4-3, 4-5, and then the 1-7-2. But that is your winner for unpowered prize. So it's not really that Blood Moon is strong. It's the combination of Blood Moon and Null Rod are strong. I think being able to be a strong 4 Null Rod deck is very important in this format. So yeah, so here you go. You can see the top 8 here. People were a little on the edge about this top 8 because it is only 3 different decks in the top 8. Your top 8 ended up being 4 Jewel decks, 3 Oath decks, and 1 kind of like an initiative tinker deck. It's almost a blue-white initiative deck. It's like we'll probably talk about that one a little bit. But yeah, so you had my friend Dan here, who was my roommate for the event, on exactly my 75 on Oath. Bosch and Roll, who was on my 75 with Oath, and Brandon Chang, who was on one of the Lorien revealed Gaia's Blessings versions. And then 4 players who were on Jewel, and then the Initiative Tinker deck. And Jewel obviously is super favored into this field. Initiative Tinker deck might be okay against Jewel. I'm not really sure. I'd have to ask Camden if that was the case, but the Jewel decks are going to be slightly favored versus the Oath decks, and that kind of just played out through the top 8 as we had Jewel taking the whole thing down. The good news is right outside of the top 8, with a bunch of records that are, almost top 8 records. You have a variety of different decks. Bug, Luris Saga Blue Black, Beseech, Countervine, Mono Red Prison, Turbo Volt Key. So you actually have a bunch of different decks over here. So it was pretty interesting to see how this all played out. And I'm obviously very happy for Dan and for Brian. I do like to see my list win in hands of really cool people. So yeah, you're over here for sure. So yes, this was a no proxy vintage tournament. The only one of 3 no proxy vintage tournaments across the globe called Eternal Weekend. So yeah, I mean, obviously Jewel had just a great showing here. Like the conversion rate of into the top 8, 4 players into the top 8 with only 26 pilots is very high. That's obviously extremely high conversion rate, where it's like a much better showing, right, than Oath of Druids, which has 68 players with 3 in the top 8. Something worth noting is I don't actually have Luris Saga separated between blue black and blue white. It's something I do intend to do at some point. But from what I can tell from just like a cursory glance, I think blue black did better than blue white. Here's your highest placing blue white deck is Sam on 7 and 2, and then Dylan 6 and 3. 3 blue black sagas at 7 and 2. Why is this 7? It's probably 7-1 in a draw. But yeah, blue black. You have some Esper, blue black, Esper, blue black. But I think actually in general that blue white deck ended up doing fairly poorly. So yeah, that's your overall showing. Let's actually compare this to, I have a sheet that has all Eternal Weekends. And again, like I said, the Eternal Weekend North America sheet is missing 8 deck lists, mostly from players who did not do super well. I'm going to try to get those deck lists and fill out the rest of the sheet. Here is your combined metagame data. This is 3 Eternal Weekends worth of data here. So, combining all 3 Eternal Weekends, you have Oath as your most played deck, 123 out of 711. And then Luris Saga, Countervine, and Initiative, followed by Combo Shops and Beseech. So that is the exact same layout as North America, which is to be expected when North America is the same size as the other 2 events combined. But basically the same set of decks here are the most played when you combine the data as North America, though the numbers end up being at least a little bit different here. You can see that Combo Shops comes way down from the North America performance because of how bad the European performance for Combo Shops was. And you actually have the best performing deck for the 3 tournaments actually being Beseech. I would probably say, looking at these numbers, they're a little close. So like all these decks around 55% would be like pretty close to the best performing decks, right? So Beseech, Jewel, Dredge, Luris Saga, and even like Oath being the highest percentage of the field still had a positive win rate. So pretty interesting when you combine these and put them all together. So Oath over all 3 events does end up with a 17% meta share, Luris Saga at 10%, and then the other ones drop down a little bit below the 10%. Yeah. So it's interesting. I did have a little comparison sheet here. I don't know like how useful this actually is, but this is like comparing and contrasting the metas between the different events, where you can see like Europe compared to Asia, the biggest percentage difference was in the combo decks. And then in comparing Asia to North America, big difference in death rate shaman decks. Lots more death rate shaman decks in Asia. This is like the wrong way around, so don't trust this. Why is this minus 4%? Anyways. So I have that here. You should be able to find this data, and if anyone needs the link, of course I can spread it out. But this is, yeah, that's what happened. So yeah, I think overall this looks pretty much like expected. Oath was expected to be the deck to beat and the most metagame share, and it was. And the decks that beat Oath, Beseech and Doomsday, or Beseech and Jewel, were the best performing decks. It's nice how you can actually see this and plan it out and make choices. Yeah, so let's go over my event.
I have a thread here on Twitter. Not that one. Not that one. That one. That goes over all my rounds, but I'm going to go through the rounds one by one. Round one was a feature match on Canberra. You can find all the feature matches for this event on Twitch TV/Card Titan. They were run by Honorog on ZD and commented for Vintage by LSV, Stephen Endian, and Kevin Cron. So I had a matchup versus one of the mono red prison players who had no power. I actually played against Patrick last year at Eternal Weekend as well. So this is a pretty cool mono red powerless deck with broadside bombardiers. This deck is heavily reliant on 4 Null Rod, 4 Blood Moon. In the board, there are a Grafdigger's Cage and the upgraded Grafdigger's Cage in Weathered Runestone. This matchup was a pretty reasonable feature camera match. Game 1, I played a turn 1 Oath, and my opponent came and just played turn 1 Karn. And I was never really able to restabilize my mana position, so the Karn just kind of locked me out. And then in games 2 and 3, I was able to use like show and tell for different things to just basically overpower the deck. In round 2, I ended up facing one of the blue-white. This one is actually not blue-white. This one is an Esper Luris Saga deck, which really threw me for a loop because I I played against them game 1, and they showed me 2 Underground Seas and a Dark Confidant. I played through I probed them, so I knew their counter magic and made it so I got to a place where I could show and tell in a Citadel. I show and tell into a Citadel, which I think is usually going to be more than enough to win the game. However, my Citadel bricked and their Dark Confidant hit a Time Walk and they one-shot me from 12 or 14. So a little unlucky to then just died. So I started sideboarding like they were blue-black because I wouldn't suspect my Dark Confidant double Underground Sea opponent to be on Esper. Oh god, there's a Caracas in the main. So yeah, so game 2 happens, and I play turn 1 Oath, and my opponent plays turn 1 without Orchard, and my opponent plays turn 1 Caracas, and I go, oh, that's a nice tech for your blue-black deck. I like it. Oh god, there's 2 dress downs too. Yeah, I'm just never beating this player. And then their second turn, they play a Seal of Cleansing and kill my Oath. And then their third turn, they play a Lavinia and a Containment Priest, and I just had no chance and died. And that was kind of a reoccurring theme for these blue-white initiative decks. Not initiative, these are not initiative. Luris decks. Containment Priest is just extremely, extremely good against the Oath deck because it's stopping both angles of attack. When you have the thing like the Grafdigger's Cage, you can still show and tell through the Grafdigger's Cage, no problem. But Containment Priest is just stopping almost everything. So if you have 3 and 4 Containment Priests in your sideboard, you're just going to be having a good time against Oath, and my opponent did. So yeah, I was dispatched in round 2, so early loss, but I had a bunch more rounds to play out. Round 3, I got to play against Cass, who went on to actually top 8 the Legacy event, and she was on the Cradle Control deck, which I thought was super cool. This is a deck that I put a lot of work into at one point, just trying to beat an Urza Saga metagame. It's basically very similar to the Legacy list. And so this was just an absolutely crazy set. I went turn 1 Oath, as I do, and my opponent had Vigor. And then I played turn 2 Oath, and she had Vigor. And then I was like, well, I'm going to lose this game unless I draw a third Oath. And I drew a third Oath. And I was able to stick that one. But it ended up being a pretty close battle where I could lose to a top deck Cradle for an Allosaurus Shepherd overrun. But it was just very, very close. Game 2 was a little different. There was a greens, maybe a natural order for an Atraxa. But my Atraxa trigger is just a lot stronger than their Atraxa trigger. And so I was able to win that match. That was a really fun match, though. Round 4, I actually played against SO63, who was on Oath. And so we played the Oath Mirror. This was a pretty wild one because we went 3 games with this one. And in the third game, he was able to resolve a Tinker for Sphinx, which put me in a really bad spot. But then I just
paid 9 mana and cast a portal to Phyrexia and killed the Sphinx. Like I had an Atraxa in play, but I couldn't get through this stupid Sphinx, and then I had to hard cast a portal to Phyrexia at 9 mana, 5 lands, and 4 Moxen. So that was just crazy. So let's see if I miss anything. Yeah. I won by playing a 9 mana artifact. So was able to beat SO6-3, and I went on to be now, let's see, was that 3-1? And then round 5, I play another Oath Mirror against Hank Zahn. So both of these Oath players are very powerful magicians. So they were really tough. This is one of the matches I actually went to time on in the tournament. We just had a lot of back and forth where we were doing a lot of top decking and drawing into things. Game 1 was like really hard because their hand was just a lot better than mine. I had to jam Oath with I probed them and they had Orchard and I had Orchard, so I didn't have Orchard supremacy. So it was like really hard to win that way, but I had to do it anyways because I was just never going to beat. It was a show and tell Atraxa. So I like I had to force the issue. And so I just tried to top deck an Orchard before they did, and I just wasn't able to. In games 2 and 3, Mana Crypt did like a lot of damage. Sometimes I take out Mana Crypt in the Oath Mirror. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. But I'm pretty sure I like won at least one of these games to Mana Crypt damage plus Spirits. I can't remember the third one, but it ended up being a very close 3-game set in the Oath Mirror. And then, so that puts me at now 4-1, going into round 6 of 9, in what I call the Jewel Incident, the Null Rod Incident, as it were. This one's gonna haunt me forever, I think. So I am playing against Eric, who is the owner of Time Vault Games, which is actually a place I played Vintage before. And Eric is on Jewel. And so I know Eric is on Jewel before the round actually starts. So I'm mulliganing to a hand that has interaction. My opponent keeps a 7, and I mulliganed all the way to 4. I didn't end up keeping a hand with interaction, but my 4-card hand was Island, Mana Crypt, Show and Tell Atraxa. So about as good as it gets. In turn 1, I get turn 1 Karned, and I end up getting Karn locked and lose. In game 2, I Thoughtseize Eric and take a 1 ring, leaving Force of Will and blue card and all their lands and artifacts and lands. And then on turn 2, I play Null Rod, which I think is going to get forced because it has to get forced, or you can't really play the game as the Jewel player. But for some reason, the Force of Will or the Null Rod just resolves. It doesn't get Force of Will. So I'm thinking to myself, like, what does that mean? What could possibly be the reason that this Null Rod is okay to be put in play? And that's when my opponent untaps and uses 6 non-artifact mana and casts Mycosynth Lattice, which they had forgotten to sideboard out after game 1 Lattice locking me, which means because they had an extra card and I had played a fetch land and we both have all artifacts that have no abilities, I simply draw out before my opponent. So the sideboard Lattice that was forgotten and was left in the deck killed me with my own Null Rod. And that's how I was eliminated from top 8 contention in this tournament. So crazy of a story. So yeah, my Null Rod kills me in round 6, and now I'm 4-2 and dead for top 8. So I'm going to play out the rest of my round to see how we can do. First, I play against JP. JP is on this blue-white deck, but like a bit of a teched out version. And this deck is kind of wild because there's 4 Mystic Remora. Oh, there's 3 Mystic Remora. So this is the blue-white Lavinia deck with Mystic Remora. It's got a Get Lost, which destroys an Oath. It's got 2 Get Lost, Containment Priest, Fragmentize, Cathar Commando. This matchup was atrocious. I got blown out in game 1, but then I was able to sneak away games 2 and 3 with some like powerful hands and awkward draws. I feel pretty lucky to be able to win this matchup. I think this is the only time I actually beat the blue-white Lurrus player.
What you think? I think get losses is pretty reasonable. Like, not a lot of decks are gonna have ways to use the map token, right? But yeah. So I was able to beat JP. So now I am going into round 8, and I am X2, and I got to play against QCPU, who I actually met at the BCDL. I knew they would probably be on prison shops, and they were. So this is 4 Null Rod, 4 Golos, prison shops. Oh, actually, no Caracas. That's interesting. I didn't realize that there was no Caracas in this Golos deck. It's kind of interesting because this actually I wouldn't consider this to be prison shops. This is like the hybrid aggro shops version that just has Golos at the top end. I still think I would include a Caracas though. But in this match, I just did Oath versus Sphere shop things, and it was not particularly close because the matchup is really, really lopsided if Oath gets to do the Oath thing. Game 2, I had to mulligan and keep like a little bit of a sketchy hand, but I was able to draw the mana that I needed to make my plays, so it ended up working out okay. So that puts me at 6-2 and in contention to prize, and I run up against Sam, the streamer, and I kind of just get destroyed in this in this matchup. There's 4 containment priests in the side, and I saw 3 of them in one game. So it was a bit rough. Seal of Cleansing, Mystic Remora, nice. So yeah, like I said, this blue-white Lavinia Containment Priest deck is just, oh, it's just a super nightmare for Oath, which actually made it so I really didn't want to play any more Vintage. That I could have maybe not played Legacy the next day and played High Roller instead. But I did not want to run into any more blue-white. Ooh, nice. I didn't know you had a Savine's Reclamation in here. This is a card I'm a big fan of in this kind of deck. It's a sweet one. So yeah, I ended up only 6-3, which is actually my worst performance of the year by a pretty substantial amount in paper. End up at something like 67th place and no chance of prizing in this event. But 6-3, like overall, not actually too bad of a record. Don't think I missed anything else in here. So yeah, that was Vintage. Legacy, I'll probably go through a little bit faster, but in Legacy, I played the same deck. I played the same 75 that I played in Europe. I really enjoy playing this red-white painter deck with 4 swords, 2 4th Aerlingas, and a Chaos Defiler. I still don't know what to do with the sideboard, but I didn't really have a good idea of how to fix it, so I just left it. But this deck is really, really fun. I really enjoy this deck. It has really cool play patterns and makes you think a lot about different things because you are a toolbox deck in your combo deck, but your combo is like the Painter Servant Grindstone combo doesn't actually happen very much because people are very trying to stop you from doing it. So you win a lot of games with just Urza Saga and Fable of the Mirror Breaker playing like a mid-range attacking plan, or just like fireball them with 4th Aerlingas. I think the 4 swords are super, super strong in this deck. The Legacy field seems to be very creature oriented. So yeah, this is the same 75 that Julian was using, so I just copied that and played it. I didn't really know that much about Legacy, the current state of Legacy going into the tournament. I didn't really practice this. I didn't practice this deck at all. I just played it again blind. So really the only Legacy I've played this year are just the 2 Eternal weekends where I played Painter. Do a quick run through of the 11 rounds of Magic that I played here. Round 1, I played against... God, I don't know. Oh, yeah, my opponent did not show up. I played against this chair, and I kicked this chair's butt. Very lucky. Round 2. Okay, so this was the 995 player Legacy tournament. I played against Mono Blue 8 cast. Pretty straightforward. I think my opponent made like one small mistake, and I was able to like really capitalize on it by just getting to Pyroblast 2 blue spells and play constructs. Let's see, 3 was I played against the Winged Hussar. Played against Ryan. Ryan was on a 5-color control deck, 4-color, 5-color control deck. This matchup is very rough for Painter. It's a really hard sometimes, but I was able to get a key Blood Moon down in game 3, which stopped Ryan from being able to cast all his spells, and I was able to sneak a win there. Round 4, so I'm currently 3-0, and I actually get a feature match versus a very competent Doomsday Pilot. You can watch this feature match, like I said, on Card Titan. Uh, Unfortunately, in this feature match, I threw away the win. It's a real rough because I just don't have a good grasp of Doomsday's speed or deck list. So like I realized pretty early that when, if you showed me a 5-card Doomsday pile and 1 card in hand and you showed me their deck in Vintage, I could tell you the exact 6 cards, right? Because I know the deck very well. I know the deck list very well. But I looked at my opponent's pile and I was like, damn, I don't know what 6 cards they have, which is really frustrating. And they play a bunch of these cards that are just not in the Vintage deck with Edge of Autumn, Night's Whisper, the LED. I didn't know if there was like 1 LED. I feel your 1 made the most sense, but it was like there was only 2 Street Wraiths in their pile, and I was like, do they play less than 4 Street Wraiths? It turns out they played 2 Street Wraiths, 2 Edge of Autumn. But basically what happened in that event, you can watch I definitely recommend watching the match, actually. It was a really, really interesting match to watch. But in game 1, I made a mistake with my engineer search where I searched for a grindstone even though I had a saga in play. And the reason I did that was because I thought I wanted to get the grindstone to disrupt Doomsday lines earlier than the saga would come out. But in the end, they were like pretty stuck on mana, and so I was just supposed to get a painter and go for the kill as fast as I could. I didn't actually get punished for that because I did draw the painter. So I was able to win game 1. Game 2, I tried to resolve a Magus of the Moon, and it got subtletied, and I put it on top of my library. But in retrospect, I probably should have put it on the bottom of my library because I knew they were going to Doomsday that turn. And I assumed they could build a Doomsday pile that beat Magus of the Moon. That assumption does end up being correct. It was something that Twitch chat went on and on about being like a greedy misplay, but there was really no misplay. So what happened in the next game turn is I drew the Magus, and what I did was cast I used my saga and made a construct to turn on an opal, and then I used a Simian Spirit Guide to cast a Magus with no floating mana. And my opponent Street Wraithed into a Daze and dazed my Magus. But the dazing the Magus doesn't actually matter at all because their pile itself just killed through Magus of the Moon. So they just had like a Swamp and a Night's Whisper, and then they Edge of Autumn with a LED, and they just make black and blue. So this one, like, I probably should have put the Magus on the bottom. But I'm not really worried about like playing the Magus into Daze. I don't think that was a huge issue. Game 3 was the game I actually threw. And I was hoping people would catch, but not that many people actually did catch it because they were still focused on game 2. But what happened in game 3 was they resolved the Doomsday pile, and I had a construct in play, a City of Traders, and a City of Traders and a Saga. And in my hand, I had a Magus of the Moon and a Pyroblast. And for me, and they resolved their Doomsday, so I have full information. And so I need to choose whether I want to play my Magus of the Moon or play a Pyroblast, or hold up a Pyroblast and make a construct. And they had just beat me, killing me through Magus of the Moon. And I didn't have a good idea on when looking through their deck, if they could kill me through Magus of the Moon or not. It turns out if I was better and knew Doomsday Legacy more, I would have been able to determine that they could not actually beat a resolved Magus of the Moon. So Magus of the Moon ends up being the better line. But in my head, I thought maybe they resolve through a Magus of the Moon. So let me just go with the Pyroblast line. And so I'll make constructs and hold open Pyroblast. And so the problem ends up being when I go for the Magus line, which is protected from Daze, I have to get a Lotus Petal because I don't have Metalcraft. However, if I go for the Pyroblast line, I actually gain Metalcraft and I can get a Mox Opal. And it turns out that Mox Opal is very important because it's the difference between using the Pyroblast and killing my opponent and using the Pyroblast and going down to 1. But I was very focused. I thought the Magus line was the line I was going to take for the most of the time I was thinking about it. And so by the time that I switched to the Pyroblast line, I didn't reevaluate the Lotus Petal versus Mox Opal part of the line, and I got the Petal instead of the Opal. And now that doesn't mean I lose on the spot, but What happens is I pass the turn and my opponent casts a brainstorm. I pyroblast the brainstorm so that's going to give me the turn to attack for lethal. However, at that point I realize, oh my god, my pedal went away and now I'm attacking them down to 1. I can still win the game by drawing a 0-drop or a 1-drop artifact, or drawing any land to play my painter from hand. But I actually draw none of those cards, and so I attack my opponent to 1 and they kill me. I talked a lot with my opponent after what I was supposed to do. Really, both of the lines that I could have chose are winning if I do them correctly. If I just get a Magus and play a Magus with Daze, ability to pay for Daze, that's winning. I wasn't really sure if that was the case or not, which is why I didn't choose it. And then choosing the Pyroblast line, Pyroblasting a Brainstorm is totally fine there. It's going to give me my lethal attack, but the problem is I messed up my lethal attack because I didn't have an Opal in play, so I only was able to attack my opponent down to 1. So yeah, that was a really interesting game, though. I definitely recommend watching it on camera. It's really cool that you have Julian and Kai doing the broadcast for this one, because you actually have a Doomsday pilot and a Painter pilot in the booth. So that was really cool. My opponent was awesome. It was they were a really powerful wizard too, so I thought that was a really fun match. So that was my first loss. Now 3-1. Then I played against this mono black scam deck. It was interesting because their build was a little bit different. I was super worried about getting turn 1 Karned, but they're not playing Karn. They're just playing more of a Heat Bears scam deck. Pretty interesting, but I was just able to like tempo them out and win. I needed to get lucky in game 2 where they had to like draw a bunch of swamps, and they just drew a bunch of swamps and died. I was gonna say like very nice opponent, but basically all my opponents for all 20 rounds of Magic this weekend were all fantastic. So I really had no complaints from that perspective. Then I play against Boros Initiative. This matchup is actually pretty reasonable, I think, because you have 4 swords to plowshares. Having a bunch of swords makes this matchup pretty crazy. But we put a pretty close 3-game set. I was able to sneak it out. Really interesting set too. Round 7 was a Boros Painter Mirror. And this was a nightmare. The Boros Painter Mirror is very hard and requires a lot of thinking because there's just like too many things happening. There's like engineers. You can engineer their engineer, your engineer. My opponent was on a very interesting brew of red-white painter where they had Fiddlebender, Oswald, as well as a bunch of white mana and things like Dusk Rose Reliquary, which I had not really seen very much of before. And it turned out that I was woefully unprepared for this mirror. My opponent's tech was really nice. So like I went for a combo and they like tutored up a reliquary and made it really hard for me to combo and then killed me. And I just kind of got bullied a little bit by my opponent's tech in this mirror. So I got kind of crushed there. So now I'm 5-2 and out of contention for top 8. But there's still you know what, 4 more rounds of this tournament. So I decided to play it out. We were gonna have fun. I was gonna have some fun and play it out. So round 8. I played against Bug. It actually ended up being a scam deck that had the Witherbloom Apprentice Chain of Smog combo in it. But my opponent really never got off the ground. And I never even saw Witherbloom Apprentice for the whole set. So kind of just played the cards and killed them there. Round 9. Oh, round 9 was a blast. So I played against Dan Miller, who's a person I know from Vintage. And we had a very loud and bantery matchup because I'm dead for top 8, so I'm just having a good time. And Dan's liable to have a good time as well. So we're being just very loud and obnoxious and having a very back and forth matchup. I'm yelling at my opponent for playing Stony Silence and having having a basic forest and basic plains in their Mystic Sanctuary deck, and it was just a really fun set. I think I got pretty lucky, and Dan made maybe a couple small mistakes that allowed me to snatch a game 3 win here, and I actually end up finishing the day 7-2. I was not planning on playing on Sunday. I was gonna go visit my friend, but 7-2 is still live for prizes. So I woke up Sunday morning and played round 10.
Round 10 was awesome. I wish round 10 was on camera, to be honest. Round 10 was a matchup versus David. I think David plays at the Legacy Pit, who was on Cradle Control. And this matchup is so hard. There's just so many things happening from the two toolbox decks. Like, there's a Bajuka Bog in the main. So, like, game one, I had a very goblin-heavy hand, but I, like, lost both pieces of my combo to a Bajuka Bog. And then in game two, like, I was playing through, there's, how many freaking endurances are there? There are 4 endurance in this deck. So if you grindstone your opponent, in their upkeep, they can endurance all the cards back before they draw. So, like, we played a 3-game set, and in game two, I think he cast endurance like 3 or 4 times. So, like, I just I didn't have enough mana and enough resources to, like, go get my Soul Guide Lantern to interrupt the endurance. So I was, like, grindstoning them because it would make them play an endurance. And so, like, I would tap them out of mana. And so it was just a really, really wild set. We went to time, and he was able to win in, like, the first turn of turns. And I thought we were both playing pretty quick in this match. There was just so much going back and forth. It was really, really wild. So yeah, I ended up losing my first round there in day 2. And then in round 11, we looked at the score and decided to draw and get min prize. I was very thankful of my opponent for doing that, because they knew what I was on, and they were on Omnitel. And this matchup does not seem remotely winnable because they had this Emrakul. So to kill them, not only do you need Painter, Grindstone, and mana, you also need a Soul Guide Lantern. And then it was just like, we played our match out anyways, and we played actually a very close 3-game set, where I ended up losing, like, just at the very, very end. But thankfully we were able to draw ahead of time, and I do end up finishing this tournament at 7-3-1 for, like, 60 something of place, maybe. Wait, where am I? No, not 60 something place, for top 128. So it's like 70, like 90th place. Yeah. So I was 99th place at 7-3-1. And so I get min prize. So actually got better prizing from the legacy deck, legacy tournament than I did from the vintage tournament. So that ends my weekend, and then I go off, see my friend, and then go home. And that actually ends basically my year for Paper Magic. I did stop and think about the year in review here, and I played 4 tournaments with Vintage Oath. I played the Buffalo Chicken Dip, where I went 7-0-2 for a first place. I played the New York tournament, where I went 3-1-2 and lost in the top 8. I played Eternal Weekend, where I went 6-1-2 and top 8'd Eternal Weekend in Europe, 6-3 Eternal Weekend in NA. And then I played the 2 Eternal Weekends for Legacy Painter. I went 8-2 and 7-3-1. So 22-5 with Oath in paper, and 15-5 with Painter in paper. So like high 70s, 78-ish or something % win rate over the year for Paper Magic, I think is really, really nice. I thought it kind of felt like I improved a lot this year. And obviously I was able to put myself in, like, a good place to get lucky. These are, like, really, really incredible scores for me. I don't think I've ever had a year quite like that. So pretty happy, all things considered. So I was able to travel everywhere, play a bunch of tournaments, and do really well, see a bunch of people. That's something I can't understate. I got to meet so many people these last couple of weekends at these tournaments who, multiple people who said, "Hey, I saw your channel, and then I started playing Vintage because of it." And I think that's, like, crazy to me, because it's such a high barrier to entry. Someone played their first Eternal Weekend after watching my channel is just wild. So I want to thank everybody again for always hanging out on Twitch and on YouTube, and supporting the content, because I don't think I would do it if you guys weren't here. And I really appreciate getting to meet everyone, sign cards, talk about Vintage. Definitely a privilege for me. And if you want to see Vintage gameplay, make sure you check out the YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.